Okay, sorry. So it's recording now. All right. I need to get into the very delicate and sensitive topic of abortion from the bioethical perspective. All right. So I just want to round up the ontological status of the human embryo, because that is going to determine how we stand on these issues at the beginning of human life, all right? And if you notice, for the past 2 lectures, I have gone into the embryonic development of the human embryo, as you in quite detail, all the way from fertilization to practically birth, but significantly at least to the 8-week embryo, which is when the embryo changes name into fetus. But here, basically at 8 weeks, all the organ systems are in place, but in miniature. Okay, and then from here forward, the next 7 months is mostly growth of tissue and organs. Okay, but everything is pretty much in place by this stage. But even what I want to point out is that from the zygote through the embryo into the fetal stage for 9 months, it's a gradual development. It's a gradual development, first of a lot of cellular differentiation. And the 4 stages of differentiation, of cellular differentiation, are what? Beginning with the most potency, as in the case of the zygote. What is that stage called? The 4 stages of development, of cellular development. Differentiation. Okay. First one starts with a T.
Trophoblast.
No, stages. Pluripotent. Pluripotent, right? Yeah. Right? And then it goes to. So pluripotent means what?
Everything.
Right? That means that that cell, we're talking about cells, real, live, organic cells that exist in nature. Pluripotent cell is a cell that can become what? Any cell in the body. Can become any cell in the body. All right? So that's pluripotent. So why is the zygote pluripotent? Mariana, come in. Okay. So why is the zygote pluripotent? Where does the embryo come from? The zygote. There's no other cell there. Okay, there's one cell. And if the whole embryo comes from the zygote, then the zygote has to be pluripotent by definition and existentially, right? Because there's no other cell for which the zygote is, the embryo is going to come. So the zygote is pluripotent. You understand why? Yeah. Because every other cell of that embryo is going to come from the zygote. What zygote am I talking about? Is this limited to the human zygote, for example, the human embryo? What about a kangaroo embryo? Are they kangaroos? Are they mammals? Yeah. Therefore, because they have air, they hold the whole temperature, right? Their own temperature, so they're mammals, and they have mammary glands. Okay, so how do they reproduce, sexually or asexually? Sexually, right. So if there's sexually reproduction, there's an egg and a sperm and there's a zygote. Okay, so it's a zygote kangaroo. And so the whole embryonic kangaroo develops from that zygote kangaroo, right? So it's not unique to humans. How about fish? Let's take one with external fertilization. Do fish reproduce sexually or asexually?
Sexually.
Asexually, you cut a fish in half and you get 2 fish?
No,
you get a dead fish, right, for bait. Okay, so they produce sexually, but do they have sex? In other words, do they have intercourse, copulation, coitus? No, because they have external fertilization, but fertilization, therefore sexual, right? Okay, you gotta be very clear on the concepts. So how do fish actually do reproduce?
They release, the female releases the eggs and then the male releases the sperm, and they fertilize outside of each other's bodies.
Exactly. Then that's why the sperm need to be motile. They have a tail and they need to find an egg, and many sperm will not find an egg and get lost and die. But the ones that find an egg will fertilize that egg, and now we have what?
Maybe.
No.
A zygote.
We have a zygote, a fish zygote, which is haploid or diploid? Diploid, because it's the beginning of a new fish. It's the new individual of that fish. No one questions that, all right? Okay, that's just straight up biology. All right, so that fish zygote, is that fully differentiated, or is that cell? No, that cell has to be pluripotent, because from that one zygote fish, the whole embryonic fish will develop eventually. So what's the next stage after pluripotent?
Pluri.
Pluri, exactly. Right? All right. So how is pluripotent different from totipotent? It helps to know that toti means total, right? That's where we'll get the word total, la totalidad in Spanish. Okay. But pluri means many, but not total. So from totipotent to pluripotent, in any species, all right, any species that we're looking at, what has happened from totipotent to pluripotent?
Is it a 3-layer?
Possibly, yeah. You're talking about gastrulation. What has happened is some cellular differentiation, some degree, the first degree of differentiation, of cellular differentiation. You understand cellular differentiation? They're becoming more and more what?
Specified.
More specified, more specific in their function, so that they're going to do certain things but not do other things. They're becoming specialized. What about the cells in our body? What are the cells in our body are what? Are they all totipotent or pluripotent? No, the vast majority of the cells in our body, the very 99.99999% of them are what? Two words. Fully differentiated, fully differentiated, right? Because the skin cells are not doing neuronal things, and the nerve cells are not doing liver things, and the liver is not doing RBCs, right? Form follows function. The function specific, each cell in our body, each tissue, each organ has specific functions. And so those cells are fully differentiated. And it's a one-way street, normally in nature. Cells don't change differentiation once they're differentiated. Okay, it's like we don't go back to our baby stage. Once we're adult, it's a one-way street. Chronologically, the clock is going forward.
And that's the exception of the induced pluripotent stem cells where they go backwards.
Yes. But why did they go backwards?
So
Naturally? How?
Not naturally.
Not naturally.
It's induced.
Induced in the lab, artificially, super duper artificially, by Yamanaka, actually extracting their 3 or 4 factors that are regulatory proteins early on. And if those regulatory proteins are put into cells, those cells go undifferentiated. They're called de-differentiated. All right? Very good. All right. So from pluripotent then, multi. Exactly. Now we're down to a particular organ system. Okay. These are becoming more and more specialized, but they still have some plasticity. They have some plasticity. Is that large enough or a little larger? Okay, so the fourth and final stage is what? Fully differentiated. Double F. Differentiated. Yeah. This is key for all biology, for all nature, all organisms growing. So the zygote has to be totipotent because it's the only cell from where all the entire individual will develop of whatever species. How about the morula? What is the name for the morula cells, individual cells in the morula? Blastomere, right? Blastomere. And what is the potency of those blastomeres? They're still totipotent. There's no differentiation between blastomeres. Okay, that's why it looks like that little berry, the mulberry. Okay, they're clustered. They're following the geometric progression of mitosis, which is a doubling of the population at every cycle. So we'll get to about the 8th stage level, right? At the 8th stage, it goes into the morula stage until about, I don't know if it's 16 or 32 stage, but eventually that little morula starts hollowing out on the inside. And a cavity, what's a cavity called? As a side for biology, you also learn a little Latin and Greek on the way, all right? So a cavity is called a coelom, okay, which is not a cilium. A cilium is a hair, but coelom is a coelom, is cavity. That's where we get the word cavity from.
Oh, coelom.
Coelom, yes, coelom, coelom, OE. The O is mute. When you have OE together, and actually it's actually written together, the letters OE. The O is mute, and coelom. Okay, so that's a cavity. In other words, the morula starts hollowing out on the inside, and at the same time, there will begin a mass of cells on the inside, and that mass of cells on the inside is called what? Inner cell mass, exactly. ICM, you'll see ICM all over the place. That's very significant for stem cell research. You'll see why later. So those cells tend to be smaller, more compacted, if you will, than the outer layer of what is now called the blastocyst. Okay. And what is the outer layer typically is called the trophoblast. And the ICM, sometimes you'll see it also as the embryoblast. That's telling you what they're going to become. So the outer layer becomes what? Becomes a placenta, because that's going to be, you can see that's going to be in contact with the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. Whereas the embryoblast, or the ICM, is where the actual embryo develops. So it'll become an embryonic disc first, forming bilateral distribution, and then the central axis and so forth. But you can see at this level of the blastocyst, we already have cells that look to the eye, they already look distinct from each other. Typically the embryoblast is a little more compacted, okay? And so is there a cellular differentiation here? Is there a cellular differentiation? Is the trophoblast the same as the embryoblast? No, they have different function, right? So they even physically look a little different, and they may not even have to look different, but there's a level, this is the first level of differentiation. We have two distinct clusters of cells, two distinct populations of cells that are gonna have different functions, and therefore this is the first level of differentiation. Yes, Jay.
Why is it referred to as becoming the embryoblast, becoming the embryo proper? What is that proper?
Yes, it's just to distinguish it from the trophoblast, which will not become the embryo proper. Okay.
So it's just like the embryo in total.
Yes, okay. In total, exactly. The whole embryo actually comes from here. However, when you think of the placenta, functionally, is a couple of things. First of all, is the placenta a vital organ or not? Yeah, can you think of a mammal embryo surviving without a placenta in nature? No. So it's a vital organ by definition, just like the heart will be and every other vital organ, right? Okay. It's a vital organ, but if it's a vital organ, it has to belong to an organism, okay? Because I just can't have a placenta laid out here by living by itself. Okay, so who does the placenta belong to? And you have two choices, either the mom or the baby, right? Belongs to the baby, belongs to the embryo. Who is generating the placenta? The embryo. At some point when the placenta becomes established, it will actually have cells from the mother also. So there's a collaboration there. But who is driving the development of the placenta? The mother cells or the embryonic cells? The embryonic cells, the trophoblast. And so the placenta belongs, it's a vital organ, in other words, another way of looking at it functionally, it's a vital organ of the embryo. Does the mother need the placenta to live and survive? No, but the embryo certainly does, right? So functionally, even if there are cells of the mother that are integrated into the placenta, all right, functionally, that placenta is a vital organ of the embryo, But it's a vital organ, but it's also what happens to the placenta at birth.
Does it come out?
It does come out, right? And then it's discarded, typically into medical waste, or there are stem cells in there that can be used, or other functions, etc. But at any point, when the baby is born, the placenta is severed from the baby.
Mhm.
So we're severing a vital organ from the organism, and the organism keeps living, right? That means the fact that it's a vital organ doesn't mean that it's a permanent vital organ. It's a temporary vital organ because it's vital during the embryonic development or fetal development. It's vital only when it's needed, which is when the baby cannot feed for him or herself or breathe for himself. All right. So that placenta is a vital organ, but it's a temporary vital organ. And while it's temporary, it's vital. But once it's birthed, it's no longer needed, discard it. Move on to the next stage of life. Okay? Question, John?
So
Yeah.
if it's a vital organ only when during the embryonic stage, how
Right.
come like some people when the baby is born they want to keep it attached before they cut it off? Like, but don't they? Isn't that attached to the like they keep everything attached? They don't want to. They want it to keep.
Yeah, fine, but it's still
not
temporary
needed.
there. It's not, it's no longer needed really, but they're trying to get the most out of that placenta, which still has part of the immune system of the mother and nutrients and a lot of stuff that is good for the baby there, But even at some point, that baby cannot carry that placenta for a couple of years, put it in a bag and just drag it along. No, it starts drying out and disintegrating, okay? Also, if they're going to extract the stem cells, the umbilical cord stem cells, right? So it's also known as mesenchymal. Those are very good because they're like embryonic quality, but it certainly doesn't harm the baby at all. So they extract the embryonic stem cells or the umbilical cord stem cells from there, all right? And then the rest is discarded and put into medical waste. But it doesn't harm the baby at all because the baby's already born. Okay, so now we just need to really move forward into these questions, existential questions, if you will, of the ontological status, right? In other words, ontos meaning the being, right? In other words, we're dealing here a little philosophically, if you will. Give me an example of a being. Human, a thing, okay, everything really is a being, if you think about it. A non-being is something that doesn't exist. So it's just a philosophical category. It's kind of a sophisticated way of saying thing, all right? So we can ask the real question, who or what is the human embryo? What being, what kind of being? We can ask what kind of being? So we can ask, well, is it human or non-human, for example, just to classify? I mean, this computer, is this a human being? No. But this, I can say this is a computer being, right? Because it's a computer thing. It exists here, and it's a computer. And so it's a computer being. A giraffe is a giraffe being, and so on and so forth for all existence. So what kind of being is the human? Human being, right? If we had to choose between human and non-human, it's so obvious that once we get there, some people are already freaking out with that. They're already having a challenge by saying that the human embryo is a human being because it starts to personalize the embryo, starts to humanize the embryo. You know what I'm getting at? Yeah. That is very difficult to kill someone that we start recognizing as human. Mm-hmm. And yet it has happened historically in our nation, 2 centuries back, where humans were being sold as if they weren't human, bought and sold and and manipulated as objects, as things. So sadly, there is precedent, and not only in this country, but throughout the world. This is a work in progress, if you will, recognizing humanity of all humans. So that's kind of the first layer. Then we can say, okay, well, but that's human embryo, and I'm using human embryo in the broad sense of the word throughout the whole 9 months. I'm not making the distinction between embryo and fetus here. I can ask the same question about the human fetus, but I'm using embryo as the whole gestational stage, all right? Broader. Then at what level? So when do we begin to be human within, because human embryo, really this process is a 9-month process overall. We can ask the question, when? Well, okay, so I certainly agree with that at fertilization, in other words, because we can ask a before and an after. Before the zygote, what do we have organically? An egg and a sperm, which are living in their proper locus, in the proper place to exist, okay? And again, you can extrapolate this to other organisms that also reproduce sexually. You have an egg and a sperm, but is that egg a new individual as such? No. What is the egg really organically and biologically? It's a sex cell. It's a gamete. Truly belongs to the mother, if you will. It's a specialized cell. It's a super specialized cell, differentiated, fully differentiated into an egg and nothing else. We can say the same for the sperm, for the corresponding sex. All right. Now, so the egg is from the mother, is not a new individual. The sperm is not a new individual, but when those two fuse, so I make a lot of emphasis on the genetic aspect of it, that zygote has 50% genome from the mother, 50% from the father. So really, the most obvious thing is that that zygote is a new individual. It's a new individual, certainly human because it had the proper genetic material. Not only the 23 pairs, but those 23 pairs are human pairs. Okay, because there are other species that also have 23 pairs of chromosomes, but not human. And that's my whole point really for the last 2.5 lectures, is that from that point forward, there's tremendous amount of development for sure, because we have to go from pluripotency to fully differentiated cells. By the time the baby is born, that baby may have at least billions, if not trillions of cells already, okay? But it all started with that one cell originally. So every other stage is a gradual stage. There's no particular stage within those 9 months when you think about it and you integrate biology with philosophy where there is a substantial change, where there's a change of being, you know, from another species to this species, or from non-species, that's another one, from non-species to species. That's another little thing that I say, there is no unspecific life on Earth, organically, biologically. From the about 1 million species that we have discovered on Earth so far, we have yet to discover just an undifferentiated blob of life. Even what approximates mostly a blob, which could be, for example, a slime mold that goes through that stage, that looks like a blob, is not really a bulb, it's a slime mold, right? Belongs to that state, to that species, and nothing else. So when we get to the human, why all of a sudden do we have such a difficulty in just accepting the biology, the reality? And sometimes you hear the question framed, when do you believe life begins, meaning human life? What is wrong really about that statement? Is that a scientific statement, for example? Is that a proper statement? When do you believe life begins? Yeah, even if I don't believe it, it's still, you know, the human embryos are not waiting, zygotes in the world aren't waiting for me to grant them life or not. They go on whether I believe it or not. They happen and they do, all right, and so do other species. So it truly is unfair, with all due respect, and people just ask it because they are not philosophers or theologians. But they ask the question, what do you believe? When do you think eternal life? Thanks. When do you think eternal life begins? Well, it's not a question of my belief. I believe in God. I believe in the Trinity. I believe in love and many things, but it's not a factual, biological thing that I look out the window, it's either there or not. Okay? So I'm giving you ammunition, if you will, or at least some tools, because in medical schools forever, you'll have people who are your professors, who are doctors, and sometimes they can be MD, sometimes they can be PhD, sometimes they can be MD PhDs, which is a super hard degree to get. And with all due respect, they're absolutely, totally confused about this. In the best case scenario, in the worst case scenario, they have an agenda. And they will pump this into the medical schools throughout the nation. And sometimes, very sadly, even in Catholic schools, Catholic medical schools, which are very few, there will be sometimes a confusion about this. Because the culture is intense, all right? It's intense, and that's the truth. So I guess you get from where I stand already significantly. Now, I made the argument for person, but person is not univocal, okay? So I don't know if you've ever heard the word univocal. What does univocal mean? Vocal is voice, a word, a sound, a word. Uni, one meaning, okay? Many words in English and in other languages are not univocal. For example, I say bear. When am I talking about bear? Am I talking about the animal? Or am I talking about to bear a burden? Or to bear it all, you know, like in a striptease or something? Mm-hmm. Any one of those three is bear, okay? Two of them are spelled differently. There's B-E-A-R and then there's B-A-R-E. But unless you see it written, just by saying bear, it's not univocal. Well, Professor, which of the three bears are you talking about? Then I have to put it in context, okay? I am bearing the burden of giving birth. Well, not me, but a woman in labor. She is bearing the labor, okay? And there's a bear outside the window in the meantime. They're trying to get in. So you got to put it in context to get the word, the meaning of the word. So person, the same. Person, we can talk about person existentially, or we can talk about person legally, or we can talk about person psychologically, like personality, all right, or personhood. Personhood would be philosophical. Personality is more psychological. Person under the US Constitution is definitely a legal definition. But you know, a legal person is also, if we decide to form we decide to incorporate, let's say that we want to incorporate, because we have found a fantastic method for getting a 600 on the MCAT, okay? And we want to patent that because we're going to sell this for $1 million each copy. And we form a corporation. We become a legal person, even though anthropologically we're 5 persons, 5 individuals, but we become one corporate person for the law. Okay, we become one legal person incorporated, you see? So person is not univocal. And I try to go to the anthropology of the word, to the root of the word, which is prosopon, like I mentioned in Greek, from classical Greek theater, the mask, exactly. Okay. And the mask simultaneously reveals and conceals, right? So I think that ultimately the human person is a mystery, and we are continuously revealing and concealing ourselves throughout life. So from that perspective, I think that the embryo could also qualify, and even the zygote, as a person, because concealing, revealing his or her humanity at the genetic level, the chromosomes, but concealing his or her humanity because it just looks like a little ball and nothing at all like the shape that we're used to looking at humans, because normally we look at born humans. So it doesn't have the shape. That's another also. See, forever you have to be bilingual here. Okay, you have to navigate in biology and in ethics or philosophy or theology. You have to be able to do that. And the philosophical argument is a distinction between form and shape, which again in the sciences many times the empirical sciences are not familiar to making those distinctions between form and shape. I used a chair as an example. All right, so give me one shape. One shape.
Triangle.
Tell me one shape.
Triangle.
Yeah, triangle. Okay. One shape. Circle. Okay. Rhombus. Okay, so you're giving me geometrical shapes. They have a commonality. You know these. You have a commonality, but is a palm tree a shape? Yeah, palm tree is a shape. You know, it's got stuff on the bottom. It's got one single trunk and so forth. It's different from a hibiscus bush, right? Different shape. All right, but they're both plants, so they have that common form. All right, even triangle. So the triangle, was that an isosceles triangle or a right triangle or equilateral? Those are at least 3 different shapes, but they're all triangles. So they have the same form. You see, they have the same substance. Sorry?
Wouldn't we also have shapes?
Absolutely. I would say we have 5 different shapes in here today. Okay, 4 young shapes and a very old shape. But do we have 5 forms of humans? No, because there don't exist 5 forms of human. There's only one form of human. It's human. It's humanity, humanness. And that's why when we go to a foreign country that we've never been before, and we see humans walking around and say, oh, look, human. Many different shapes of humans, but all humans. Because we can intuit, we have the capacity to intuit the substance of things, which is the form. And in fact, even grammatically, the substantive, right, in the grammar, what's another name for substantive? The noun. The noun is what tells us the thing. El sustantivo tells us what thing is it. What are we talking about? Human. Okay, so, all right, forward. People clear then about this ontological status, right? Now we need to touch on the very delicate subject of abortion, but this is obviously a very challenging one because just from the start, you know that abortion is legal in the United States. Since when, by the way?
19.
Not too long?
Wasn't it the Roe versus?
Exactly.
1990 something?
1973. Yes. Yes, 73. So it's been 45 years. Okay. In 1973, the Supreme Court of the United States decided to not grant legal personhood to the embryo, basically, to the human embryo. It was, of course, a legal challenge to a woman because abortion was illegal before 73 in the United States, okay? And the assumption was that the human embryo was human, and no one had never questioned the humanity of the human embryo, the personhood of the human embryo from a legal perspective, because the Constitution only defends legal persons. And in the Constitution, I'm talking about the Constitution of the United States, there's no mention about the embryo either way. So it only talks about persons are free and have a right to life and so forth, but it doesn't say if those persons are born or unborn. So the Constitution, really, the US Constitution is silent with regards to the human embryo, the human embryo is a person or not. We can assume that back then it just wasn't questioned that the embryo would not be a human person, okay? It just wasn't questioned. But being a legalistic society, some people pushed the case and took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a split decision, decided that actually came down to 1 because it was 9 and 4 and 4, and 1 broke the tie. Justice Blackburn was his name. He said, and the reason he used was because there is no consensus whether the human embryo is a person or not. I'm kind of paraphrasing the decision. Because there is no consensus in society when human life actually begins, something like that. Therefore, we have to err on the one that we know is definitely human and alive and a person, which is the mother. the pregnant mom. Her name was, she was Roe, fictitious name Roe in that case. I'll write it here. Jane Roe versus Wade was the challenge. The state of Texas. It was Wade, because this is a case from Texas. Okay, so Jane Roe was her fictitious name, so she would remain anonymous. And Wade, I think it was John Wade, was in the state of Texas, which was trying to maintain the humanity of her unborn, of the human embryo. So Justice Blackburn said, well, we know that Jane Roe, this woman, is definitely human and a person because she's standing in front of us and she's alive, all right? And because there's no consensus about her unborn, then we have to err on the side. I have to choose here between one or the other. So here on the side of the mother, and therefore that became that crucial decision in 1973 of Roe versus Wade. And it has been that way since. So it means that the unborn is not a legal person, so it has no protection under the law. And therefore the human embryo can be killed up until birth, for the whole 9 months. Yes. Surprise. Has no legal protection until the head of the fetus is not outside of the body of the mother, literally outside of her tract. That is not a legal person. So at some point they actually have to decide where does the legal person reside, in the head or the body of the person legally. And they had to go for the head because we can have people who have no arms and no legs and they're still human. They have a trunk and head, all right? And so very minimally it was the head. So once the head is outside of the mother, then that is a legal person and has to be protected. And the same abortionist who was doing the abortion, if that fetus is born alive, that same abortionist by law has to try to save now the life of the baby that he or she was just trying to kill a couple of minutes ago. Because now all of a sudden this baby is a legal person and has full protection under the law.
If the head is coming out first, then they have to try and save the baby?
No, so normally the head is first, right? The crowning is the head first, is the normal birth, normal delivery. In fact, if the baby's breech, right, it's a problem, and they try to change that around. But to the point that there is, so it's legal for the 9 months, but after the second trimester, the mother needs a medical reason for having an abortion. Maybe that's what you're thinking of. After the second trimester, the mother needs a medical reason, but that medical reason can also be psychological. In other words, that this baby is traumatizing me, is causing me anxiety, and there's always a judge at the local level that will grant that permission. There's always a doctor who is willing to say that this baby is causing distress, this pregnancy is causing distress. So they'll talk about the pregnancy, they won't talk about the embryo. They'll talk about the pregnancy. This pregnancy is causing this woman distress, okay? And that's a clinical condition, all right? It's endangering her health, and therefore she can get a judge who will sign off on that, and then she can get the abortion. But the bottom line is that truly abortion is legal for the whole 9 months in the United States since 1973. That's the reality. That's the crude reality of what we have. Of course, most abortions are not done in the second or third trimester because at that point, the mother, what has happened between the mother and child?
They connect to each other.
Exactly, they have bonded. Okay, there has been bonding. She's hearing that heartbeat, that kid is moving around, kicking around, and everything else, so there's a bonding aspect. Okay. All right, so from the objective perspective, if you will, abortions can be classified into 2 types, bioethically speaking, either a spontaneous abortion or later on known as a miscarriage, or a procured, elective, or induced abortion. Okay, so we're trying to define this term more and more in a bioethical context. Spontaneous abortion typically happens within the first 8 weeks or even earlier, 6 weeks or so. And it's Typically, the little embryos fail to implant, or shortly after implanted are discarded. Okay. If it happens later in the pregnancy, then it's called a miscarriage. But what I want to point about this process is that it's a natural process that was not, the will was not engaged. It's not that the mother wanted to get rid of that pregnancy, okay? There's no will engaged here. It's a biological, it's a physiological process. So what is your intuition about these little embryos? And by the way, the vast majority of them happen early on in pregnancy, in the first 2-3 weeks of pregnancy. Why do you think that happens? Why do you think spontaneous abortions happen?
It's body. Sometimes they can't, like, they can't, really
Sustain the pregnancy, yes.
Maybe it didn't attach correctly to the uterine wall, like
right.
Topic, something.
Yeah, okay. Now, what happens is that when these little embryos have been examined, because sometimes it's difficult, if it happens in the first couple of weeks of pregnancy, the mom may just think that she's late in her period. She's not really aware that she's pregnant, and she just thinks she's late. But actually, she's passing an early embryo, all right, and she's having an early abortion. But she wasn't aware that she was pregnant because she didn't have any other symptoms, and therefore it was a very early spontaneous abortion. When some of these little embryos have been able to be examined, the vast majority of them show that they have what? Some kind of abnormality, exactly. Abnormality, deformity, some genetic defect, okay? So this is a process of natural selection. And we have one of the highest rates of spontaneous abortions in nature. Globally, it's about 50%, depending on who you read and how it's classified. Also, it's very much underreported, right? Because like I say, sometimes a woman can be pregnant, she doesn't know it, and she just thinks she's later in her period, but she's actually having an early abortion, a spontaneous abortion. Globally, it's around 50% more or less. What does that mean? That means that half of all pregnancies, of all human pregnancies, never make it to term. About half of them. That's a lot. So the world population could be double if all pregnancies would have made it to term. All right. And most of the time it happens early on, like I said, within the first 2 or 3 weeks of pregnancy. And the vast majority of those little embryos have some kind of a birth defect with them, some kind of genetic abnormality. So it's a natural selection process. The chemistry just didn't match. And the body of the woman was smart enough, if you will, biochemically smart enough to discard that embryo. There's no guilt involved in there. Because there was no human will, you see? It's a natural process. It's a little more sad when it happens later on, because now the mom is aware of the pregnancy and she may or may not want the pregnancy, but if she did want it and it's a miscarriage, then it's a loss and it's a sadness for that woman, and she will grieve for her child, but again, it's a natural process. She had nothing to do with it, unless, for example, she was just totally reckless about her pregnancy later on, and she started horseback riding, galloping when she was in 4 or 5 months of pregnancy, and then she actually provoked that miscarriage, okay? But if she was not reckless, let's say, in her pregnancy, and she had a miscarriage, there's no fault there. It's just a natural process. Again, that little embryo, more likely than not, will have some kind of deformity. Okay? Very different, procured or elective or induced abortion. All these adjectives are pointing to the engagement of the will. That somehow the will is engaged and that pregnancy was not wanted, and so this abortion was done on purpose, we can say. Okay? And then we can look at that from the bioethical perspective. Procured, elective, or induced, these are the words that you see going around.
So for other abnormalities, like
yes.
Down syndrome,
yes.
Nature doesn't discard them.
Exactly. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So we can also say that not all Down syndrome children make it naturally. Some are discarded on the way. but many do make it. It's called compatible with life. And because Down syndrome is a particular chromosome, which chromosome is it?
21.
Yes, chromosome 21, which is the smallest chromosome. It's also known as 21 syndrome. And it's an extra chromosome 21. Okay, now these extra chromosomes do happen. It's at second meiosis. The process, the genetic process is called non-disjunction at second meiosis, when the genes are supposed, the chromosomes are supposed to, oops, I don't have it here, that meiosis picture's worth 1,000 words. Yeah. So second meiosis, we're here of the egg. Here is where finally, see, these are chromosome pairs lining up at the, sorry, there's the chromosome pairs, they're splitting into single set. And then finally, at this second meiosis here is where the chromatids split and migrate to opposite poles. The centromere gives way, all right? And the chromatids migrate to different poles. That's the normal process. Sometimes this doesn't, they don't split, and this pair stays together, so that this one egg will end up with a pair, let's call this chromosome 1, and here there would be 0, chromosome 1, okay? And this one has 2 chromosome 1s. That's non-disjunction. They did not disjunction. They did not separate the junction, all right? And that's, again, non-disjunction. It happens from the second meiosis here. And this egg would end up with an extra chromosome. And it happens with all the chromosomes from 1 to 23. Actually, 1 to 22. 23 is, well, in the female is spared, yes. But my point is that chromosome 21 is the smallest one, and it also happens to have the least amount of genetic information. And so an extra load of chromosome 21 is actually compatible with life. It has some consequences. Some are physiological, some are psychological. So we know that that's why it's called a syndrome, because there's a range of symptoms. Syndrome is a range of symptoms. On the physiological symptoms of Down syndrome, they have the typical slanted eyes. They have sometimes a cleft palate. Their tongue tends to hang out a little bit. So they have some features, some facial features. Some can be, and the range is from very mild to you can almost not tell that they're Down syndrome, to very severe when it's very obvious, even when they're born. That's at the physiological level. Including also at the psychological level, you also have a range from the very mild, which they essentially have a normal IQ, to very severe, well, they'll have severe mental retardation, okay? And then you have the combination of those two ranges, and that's Down syndrome. But the bottom line is that because overall chromosome 21 is the one that has the least genetic information, then an extra load of it is still viable, is still compatible with life. When it happens with the other chromosomes, the extra load is too much information, and typically those become either spontaneous abortions or miscarriage, and they're being selected out. But that non-disjunction can happen in any one of the 23 pairs of chromosomes, all right? And it happens at meiosis 2 here, in the egg typically. Because the sperm is not going to be competent, it's not going to be the most vigorous sperm that is going to be the one to fertilize, if it happened at the non-disjunction of the sperm. Okay, so forward then over here. Now, let's look at some clinical definitions for abortion. First of all, I'm looking at the procured abortion. It is, the will is engaged, all right, to essentially kill the unborn child. And it is objectively a grave bioethical evil because it's another human being. And truly, since 1973, 60 million procured abortions have happened in the United States alone. 60 million. It is staggering. Really, it is. When you think about it for a moment, you compare that to the number of deaths that have been in any one particular war. No war has had this many casualties. Not even the Second World War, when you include all the Nazi concentration camps, it's estimated that 12 million people were killed in the concentration camps, in the Nazi concentration camps, of which about 6 million were Jews, meaning that the other 6 million were non-Jews. They were, some were gypsies, some were homosexuals, some were people with mental disabilities or physical defects. Some were Catholic. In other words, Hitler was expanding his mania. He was going after more and more groups because they did not qualify as being Aryan, as being the perfect human. Okay, now I'm talking about the Holocaust. And that was 12 million. So we left that behind a long time ago. This is truly the largest genocide in the history of humanity. And worldwide, it's close to 500 million, 500 million easily, worldwide, since 1973. 45 years, not even half a century. It's the largest genocide in the history of humanity just by the numbers. Okay, so we're talking about something that is serious. Okay, this excludes, this number does not include these very early abortions, these abortifacients of the IUD, the pill, and Plan B, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you'll see what I mean. Let me look at some definitions. Let's look at some. This is from Keith Moore. Moore is a standard textbook in embryology. I don't know what edition, it's many editions. This is one of the most standard textbooks in medical, clinical embryology in medical schools. Defining different types of abortion. Threatened abortion, when the woman has bleeding, but there's no abortion yet, it's a threatened abortion. Okay, the woman is bleeding and could lose that pregnancy. Spontaneous, we talked about. He puts it up to 12 weeks here. 3 months, the first trimester. So the first trimester. Sorry? Okay, habitual. Oh yes, spontaneous is the second one. You want that? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me try to make that a little bigger.
14. 12, 14.
Well, I'm pretty sure it's it depends on the clinics, because not everyone will do.
What is?
A certain amount of weeks.
Yes, yes, they have to do.
It depends on the doctors too.
Yes, that's right.
Some will and some won't.
Exactly, and the equipment that they have and all that. It depends on the clinic or the hospital, right? We'll get into that in a minute. Let me just go up a little bit here. The words. Okay, so we saw threatened and spontaneous. Now, habitual is a woman that has a loss of abortions. 3 or more has natural losses. 3 or more pregnancies that were lost, okay, through spontaneous abortion. That is a habitual abortion. In other words, that woman is at high risk pregnancy. In other words, she cannot sustain the pregnancies normally, right, for a number of reasons. That's called habitual. Induced is what I talked about, otherwise known as elective or procured. He puts it here after 20 weeks because he's putting viability at 20 weeks. Actually, right now in the United States, or at least in this area, viability is about 23 weeks. A little baby girl that was saved by Baptist Hospital a few years ago. She was able to survive after 23 weeks. Little tiny, she fit in the palm of the hand. A little fetus. An incubator, you've heard of NICU, N-I-C-U, right? It's neonatal ICU. They're almost artificial wombs. Those little babies are all intubated. All the equipment is minute. Okay, a complete abortion is all the products of the conception have been expelled. Very important, because if the abortion is incomplete, it's also known as what? Extremely dangerous. It's also known as botched abortion, it means that some piece of the embryo remain inside, or the fetus, and that's extremely dangerous because that's going to what's going to happen to that piece of leg or brain or piece of the embryo inside the fetus.
You can cause infection, sepsis, bacteria.
Exactly. Infection, sepsis, septicemia, and death for the mother, of course. So these botched abortions are extremely dangerous. Okay. Missed abortion is sometimes the fetus dies in womb and was never detected. Even one of these missed abortions is called papilliform abortion or papilliform fetus. I'm going to leave this one for you to look up. Look up papilliform fetus. Has a reference to paper. Has the shape of a paper. Here's a classical example of misspell. That should not be formed, that should be papyrus shaped. Because they're not talking about the form of the fetus, they're talking about the shape of the fetus. Paper-shaped fetus. Look it up. Okay. That's one type of a missed abortion. The fetus or the embryo dies in utero. The mother may or may not have detected it, and then it's a subsequent pregnancy that is growing normally. What happened to that previous embryo or fetus? Miscarriage, we talked about earlier. Later, he puts that after, I guess he puts it midway. Oops. Puts it midway at 135 days or something. Yeah. He puts it halfway through the semester, the second trimester. But some of these terms, this one in particular, miscarriage and spontaneous, are a little fuzzy, the boundary, okay? I mentioned that these three devices or techniques may also be abortifacient. Of course, their intention is not to be abortifacient, right? But to be contraceptive. The IUD is actually a combination of mechanical and chemical because it's trying to prevent fertilization. But sometimes fertilization happens, and now you have a little embryo, so the IUD goes into the uterus, right? And the IUD essentially, what does the IUD do? You have this little copper T inside the uterus touching the walls of the endometrium. What naturally touches the wall of an endometrium? What naturally touches the wall of an endometrium? That could be the embryo at hatching. Remember apposition when the embryo is seeking to embed, to implant, right? So now you have this copper T touching artificially, obviously, the endometrium. The endometrium is fooled into thinking that what? It is pregnant, yeah, that there's implantation. And so it's a whole hormonal cycle is going to start to suppress ovulation and to suppress another implantation. So it's fooling the uterus and the body of the woman into thinking that it's pregnant. So it's going to suppress ovulation. Okay? That's when the copper T works properly, the IUD. In addition, many of these copper Ts now at the tip, they have estrogen, and they release, it's a slow release of estrogen going on, or other hormones. But that's the intent. However, if there is ovulation, which is sometimes known as breakthrough ovulation, right? Which can also happen with the pill. Ever heard of a woman who was on the pill 100% and she got pregnant?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that means it happens, right? And that was not magic. So that's called breakthrough ovulation, that in spite of the hormone inhibition, hormonal inhibition, her uterus still had an ovulation. But you were defined. Yes.
Wait, the IUDs, you said it was mechanical.
It's mechanical and chemical, he said.
For IUD.
We weren't supposed to do this.
We never went over it and put it in the email too.
What do you mean?
You said don't do that half since we never talked about abortion, like on the old.
I thought he said we had to do everything, so I did everything.
You don't pay attention.
Yeah, you don't.
You guys are so nasty and bitter. What happened?
So is the
Nasty and
pill
bitter.
chemical or mechanical?
It's
It's
chemical.
chemical.
There's
I
no
was
mechanical.
asking. She-
Yes, they have this, bro.
You need to just focus on yourself and just study.
I love how you came with your coffee cup. Are you mad? Are you okay? Are you tired? Are you just I still love you. This is an interesting topic. Look how many notes I took today for the first time.
Where are we? 12:05 again. Something doesn't want to get me through this chapter, this topic. Okay, so breakthrough ovulation can happen, which then what is going to happen is that the embryo, if there was intercourse, there's millions of sperm floating around. So whatever egg is around, hanging out at the ampulla is normally going to get fertilized, all right? Which is going to start from the zygote stage through 5 to 7 days of development. Blastocysts will seek to implant, but because there's already this copper T there, then this is going to prevent, the T is going to prevent implantation and will discard the embryo. And so that's an abortion. People say, well, that's a spontaneous abortion. But why is it not a spontaneous abortion?
Because you're inducing it with the actual IUD.
Exactly. The IUD is provoking that. If the IUD were not there, that would not be, it could still be a spontaneous abortion, but it could be an implantation. And so the IUD is causing that abortion, okay? And it's not the IUD. The IUD doesn't have a will. It's everyone involved in placing the IUD there. So that's why it is an induced abortion, and you'll get questioned on this big time in medical schools and say, oh, no, it's the IUD is not an abortifacient. FDA, which regulates all these chemicals, will absolutely deny that the IUD is an abortifacient. But the data is there, okay? The pill can also have, because of the breakthrough ovulation, it's not the primary purpose, but it can happen. And people who are on the pill, women who are on the pill religiously every day, including the placebo part, okay, sometimes do get pregnant. In fact, I'll tell you, it's 99.9% effective. What does that mean? 99.9, so 0.1 will get pregnant. So it means 1 out of 1,000 women who are taking the pill religiously, who are taking the pill rigorously, 1 out of 1,000 on average will get pregnant. That's the stats. And 99.9 is a very high, it's a degree of certainty, it's a very high p-value, right? It's a super high, very rigorous, but that's what it is. So plan B, of course, plan B is after pregnancy, after fertilization, the day after or 2 or 3 days after, they take a huge mega dosage of estrogen, basically, in two dosages, all right, to force, if there was no fertilization, of course, this mega dosage will suppress ovulation, all right, and the sperm can stay within the tract alive for how long?
5 days.
5 days. Okay, so 5 days after the intercourse, it could still be pregnancy. But if she takes this plan B the day after the intercourse, it could possibly, if fertilization hasn't happened yet, but if fertilization has happened, it also, this plan B pill with this levodogestrel also makes the endometrium inhospitable, which will then prevent implantation and cause an abortion. So that's the other one. So those three can be abortifacients also. Yeah. So you have 3 types of methods, either medical, surgical, or combination. Medical is the chemical one, like the pill, for example. Surgical is the mechanical, actually going in and dislodging the embryo of the fetus by various means. That's called surgical because it does involve surgery. and a combination of both, like the IUD, for example. The more typical drugs for inducing abortions are mifepristone, which is also known as RU486, RU for the farm that developed it, Russell Uclaf. Russell, you don't have to worry about that, but that's the pharmaceutical company that developed it, and that probably has to do with the number of trials that they did to get it right. Misoprostol, which is also known as Cytotec. You'll see these on the market, and you can get these over the counter, by the way, in any over the counter in drugstores.
The Cytotec is the one that you put up the vaginal canal, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, one is topical, the other one is by mouth oral. These are the different stages. So at this, whether it's first trimester, second trimester, or third trimester, obviously there's development going on big time, and therefore different methods will be used. Earlier on, it can actually be done by a suction tube, vacuum, either electrically or manually. Then once you start crossing this boundary, then dilation and curettage, the woman has to be dilated, the cervix has to be dilated, which takes time. And then curettage, a curette is similar to a scalpel that has a curved point, and the curette cuts. It's extremely sharp. It cuts the embryo in pieces, and then it's sucked out with a vacuum. When it's later on, it's intact. Dilation and extraction is too big, too hard to cut through the bone of the fetus, actually, and it has to be taken out intact, and that's called DNX, all right? Or hysterotomy, which would be similar to, well, taking out the, doing a surgical procedure on the uterus. Dilation and evacuation is midpoint. These are all mechanical, if you will, and these are the chemical ones. And the third trimester, you get all the way to partial birth abortion, which is a type of DNX, but it's a particular type because here the fetus is fully developed, ready for birth, all right? So you have basically 1.5 feet on average of the fetus that is fully formed. And so but if the head comes out alive, then that automatically requires a legal personhood. So when a DNX is done, the abortionist has to make sure that this fetus is killed inside the womb before extracting. And so this is a technique. It's extremely gruesome. They'll turn the embryo typically in a breech position, then they'll insert a cannula right into the cranium through the base of the cranium and literally suck out the brain, okay? And then the cranium will collapse. It's called a craniotomy, fetal craniotomy, and then it's easier to pass through the crowning of the mother. That's called partial birth abortion, and it's still legal in the United States. Most women don't get there, of course. Most abortions are done in the first trimester simply because of the bonding that happens with the woman. But these are just the cold facts of what is occurring today in the United States. Okay. Look at this last slide, all right, because these are the healthy alternatives to an abortion, and I don't want to delay you any further. I apologize for keep delaying. I'll send you this PowerPoint, but you can pretty much figure out what are healthy alternatives to try to exhort women, moms, pregnant moms, to give life to their unborn, all right? I think that it's very important to give them full support in whatever it is that they need at many different levels, and the state does that. Many states in the United States, including the state of Florida, Department of Children and Families, DCF, comes in and helps that mom with free medical, even if she has other kids already born, free medical for the whole family, food stamps, the works. There's a lot of groups out there that are willing to help these moms, because obviously this would be an unwanted pregnancy, right? A woman does not seek an abortion when she wants a pregnancy. So these are unwanted pregnancies. We just need to reflect a little bit more and see how we can help these moms to give life to their babies. Okay, I'm gonna end it here.